Good morning. Welcome to the first Texas Schools Project Seminar of 2012. And so today we're going to open up with an exciting presentation. Dr. Robert Jackson, I'm going to call him Bo. Same as the athlete, better academic. Slightly worse athlete. Bo is an assistant professor at Northwestern University. He's published on teacher labor markets, in particular focusing on Charlotte Mecklenburg. But I really want to highlight this work. So this would normally be the place where I was focusing on all the academic journals that he's published in. I decided to scratch that out. You know, this work has been covered in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. And so I think it's interesting and certainly exciting. It's a way to start the year. So I'll just pass it on to Bo. All right.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk here, specifically, well, for a variety of reasons, but one is that I know a lot of people in the room are very familiar with the program, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of interesting comments and feedback from me as well, so I look forward to presenting here. So so I'll be talking about the effects of a novel incentive-based high school intervention on college outcomes. Is there a way to dim the lights by any chance? So typically when I talk about this, I sort of motivate it by talking about the fact that other districts in other states are implementing very similar programs. But given that I'm actually talking in Texas, I don't think I need to motivate it that way. I'll just say that the model that I'll be talking about, this advanced placement strategies model that I'll be talking about, has been adopted in a variety of different states across the nation. So the program I'm talking about today, although it's Texas-based, really does have applications outside of Texas and across the United States. And I think it was just very recently, about 2 months ago, the Navy decided to adopt this program as well in their schools. So the basic idea, I'll just give you an overview of the program. So the program I'm going to talk about is called the Advanced Placement Incentive Program, or APIP. And the program itself was targeted to high schools with very high shares of ethnic minority students and high shares of low-income students. And the primary goal of this intervention was to increase college readiness among students of these schools. So the program in its current form started in 1996 in 10 Dallas high schools by AP Strategies. I know. I better get this information right. So they are I actually went over this yesterday, Dallas-based nonprofit organization that administers the program. I'll talk about exactly what they do later on. So the program now exists, this actually number might not be accurate anymore, in 61 high schools across the state. Is that right? It's more than that now. 66 now. So 61 at the time that I wrote the slides, 66 now, so it's expanding here as well. And it has been replicated in about 8 states, and there are 28 other states right now that are actually applying for grants to implement it at the moment. I think it's actually more up to 9 or 10 at the moment. So the basic program I'm going to sort of identify 5 main components of the program. So that at the heart of it are these student and teacher monetary incentives. So the program pays 11th grade and 12th grade students and their teachers for each passing score earned on an advanced placement exam. And I'll go into greater detail about how that works in a second. But in addition to that, there's teacher training for AP teachers and pre-AP teachers, and this is to ensure that when a student takes an advanced placement course, that they're actually getting a proper advanced placement course, and that the teachers know what they're doing. There's also curricular oversight by the College Board. This is to ensure that when someone's in an advanced placement class, it is actually an advanced placement class. One thing that happens often in a variety of different school districts across the country is you have something that's being called an AP class, but it really isn't really an AP class. It's just sort of the class that perhaps some students are tracked into, and they'll call it AP for administrative purposes. But this curricular oversight really ensures that the material that is taught in the classroom is properly aligned with the test. There are also some additional AP tutoring and prep sessions that are held a few times a year, and then another key component is open enrollment. So in many school districts, often what you see is that either to get into the AP program, the student either has to be recommended by a teacher, or they have to have a score above a certain level to get into the program. One of the key components of this program is that there's open enrollment. Any student who wants to take an advanced placement course or take the AP exam is allowed to do so. So just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'm going to look at the effect of this program on outcomes several years later. So I'm going to look at the effect of the program on college going, freshman year GPA, persistence, and being enrolled in college for your sophomore year, given that you've been enrolled in your freshman year, and also I'll present some evidence on degree attainment. So I'm going to use what is called a difference in difference strategy and identify the effect across different cohorts, and that's how I'm going to sort of pick out the causal effect of this program, and I'll go into greater detail about that. So to tell you what the results are beforehand, I'm going to find positive effects on college outcomes, and I'm going to find larger effects for Black and Hispanic students in particular. And because the intervention was not a random controlled design in the sense that, they didn't sort of randomly decide which schools adopted the program and which ones didn't, I'm going to have to show you a variety of tests, or at least talk about a variety of different tests that I'm going to do, and that I do, to at least show you that what I'm going to show you is true, a real true causal effect, and not just an artifact of something else that may be going on in the data. So it's important to do that to sort of convince you that what I'm showing you is the real true positive effect of this program. So by way of motivation, if you were to look at the college going and completion rates across different socioeconomic groups, you start to see large differences. So the first thing is, if you just look over here, I broke these things down by ethnicity. If you look at the percentage of high school graduates or GED holders between the ages of 25 and 29 who ever enrolled in any college based on the 2006 March CPS, you'll see that for whites, about 71% enroll in college, compared to just about 60% for blacks and just over 50% for Hispanics. Now, you might think that, well, if the main reason that we see these large differences in college going has to do with college preparedness, then at least given that you go to college, we shouldn't see very, very large differences there. However, that's not the case. Even amongst those that actually go to college, the college completion rate for whites is about 70%, just under 70%, and just over 50% for blacks and Hispanic students. So there's something going on that's affecting both college going and college completion once you get there that might, hopefully, this program might actually try to improve. So researchers who've looked into these differences basically attribute a lot of these differences to differences in family characteristics and scholastic preparedness beforehand. And because much of these gaps occur not only amongst those who go there, but also amongst those before they get there, but also once they actually arrive, you might think that a program that can improve the college readiness amongst all students might actually be able to reduce some of these gaps. So that's sort of I think the goal of the program is to try and remove, I guess, improve college readiness for these populations so that we can reduce some of these educational gaps in college going and college completion. And this is what I'm going to be looking at in this paper. So differences in course rigor is one possible explanation for the differences that we see. So there's some work by Kristen Klopfenstein who's looked at differences in advanced placement course offerings across schools and across school districts. And what she finds is that typically schools in low-income areas and rural areas are much less likely to offer these rigorous advanced placement courses or international baccalaureate type course offerings. So you might think, well, maybe part of the reason we're seeing these differences is that these students are just not exposed to rigorous course material before they actually graduate from high school. But it turns out this isn't the entire story, because even when you look within schools that offer advanced placement courses, you typically find that those that are in the advanced placement classrooms tend to be the more affluent, the more likely to be white, more likely to be Asian than those who are not in these classes. So there are a lot of different explanations for why this could be the case. One of them might be, well, if students are being sort of tracked into advanced placement courses, perhaps what's happening is that there are differences in academic preparedness. So these lower income ethnic minority students are less likely to be in these classes, but there also could be other differences as well. I'm going to highlight 4 of these differences. One might be differences in information. So there's actually a good amount of data indicating that the understanding of how to negotiate the college-going process is much, much lower among students who are from sort of less privileged backgrounds, primarily because their parents didn't go to college, so they don't know what the benefits are. So they may not necessarily know, oh, it's a good idea to take several AP classes. That'll help you get a leg up in the process, and it'll help you do better when you get there. But that's something they wouldn't necessarily know, and that could explain some of the differences that we see. Other differences might be teacher expectations. There's also some research out there indicating that a level of teachers' expectations for students and the ways teachers interact with students does have something to do with the socio-demographic characteristics of the students. For example, if you have a name that sounds distinctly poor or distinctly black, sometimes teachers might expect you to do worse than otherwise, and there's evidence that this is the case. There are also some differences that might pertain to social norms. There may be different social norms across groups. There's this notion out there that if amongst certain populations, if you study hard, you might be acting white. This is not something that exists in all schools, but it's something that has been documented in some schools. And finally, there might be differences in sort of myopia. Certain students might be more forward-looking than others. They might be thinking about the future 30, 40 years down the line, so they're more likely to invest in their education today, whereas others may be less sort of oriented towards the future. And all these differences might actually generate differences in the likelihood of participating in an advanced placement program above and beyond differences in academic preparedness. And just to give you a brief overview of AP courses, so these are college-level courses that are typically taken by students in 11th and 12th grade. They can be used for credit at most colleges in the US. There are 35 courses and exams across 20 subject areas, and the cost per exam is currently $82, and a fee reduction of $22 is granted to those with demonstrated financial need. The program started in 1995, and these fees have changed over time, so this is just the current number. And exams are graded from 1 through 5, where 3, 4, or 5 are passing scores, 5 being the highest. So the rationale for this emphasis on advanced placement is based on a lot of sort of correlational evidence, basically, observational evidence. And it turns out if you look at the data, you typically find that students who take AP courses are more likely to have high SAT scores, they're more likely to enroll in college, they have higher college GPAs, and they're more likely to complete college. And there are a series of studies showing these correlations. Now, one important critique of these studies is that they may not necessarily reflect the real causal effect of the program. And this is particularly important when we think about the fact that some students actually take the advanced placement programs as a way to signal to colleges that they are a highly motivated student. So if we think that the advanced placement program may be serving as a signal for ability, the fact that we see these correlations in the data is not surprising, and the program may actually be doing nothing at all for students' outcomes at all. Having said that, the fact that these correlations exist is what really motivated the emphasis on APs, but I think it's important to sort of question that assumption and say, well, maybe this program isn't necessarily having an effect in and of itself, so it's nice to get some evidence that this is going to be a beneficial program. One of the sort of nice things about this intervention, even though it does sort of couple cash incentives for students and teachers with teacher training, it does also allow you to see differences in advanced placement participation across different cohorts that doesn't really have anything to do with selection per se, and I'll talk about exactly how that works in a second. So it allows us to get some evidence on whether the advanced placement program improves outcomes or not, and it seems as though they do. So another reason why I think this study is interesting from a policy perspective is that I think it allows us to answer the question about the relative efficacy of late interventions versus early interventions. So there's a lot of evidence out there that early interventions can be really effective. I won't go into too much detail, but if you can get to a child when they're 4 or 5 or 6 years old, you can make a world of difference. And there's this notion out there that once they get to high school, once they're 14, 15, 16, it's just too late to do anything. So in some sense, if you can find a program that is affecting students in 11th and 12th grade, and it's actually having positive effects, it does suggest that this notion that somehow when you're 16 or when you're 16 years old, it's too late to do anything, it sort of dispels that notion. So I think it's important just for that reason alone. Another thing I'll say is that if you think that the reason that we see this underperformance for certain student populations is not just because, they just, they don't know how to do it, but if it really has something to do with all those examples I gave up about differences in motivation, differences in information, maybe teachers aren't putting in the optimal amount of effort, maybe students aren't putting in as much effort as they otherwise would. If these are the reasons that we're seeing underperformance among certain student populations, then it's entirely possible that an intervention that targets students who are 17 or 18 could be very, very, very beneficial. So I'm just saying the source of the underperformance is really, really important. So there's no reason, at least on a theoretical level, why we wouldn't necessarily expect to see this program have a big effect. So now I'll just talk about the program schools over time. I should just mention I'm very open to answering any kinds of question at any point in time. I'm used to being interrupted all the time by economists, so shoot if you have any questions. So the program itself was rolled out over time, and it wasn't adopted by all schools at the same point in time. And this turns out to be really, really, really helpful for me in teasing out what the causal effect of the program is going to be. So the first 10 schools adopted the program in 1995-96 academic year. Then one program adopted it in 2001. There were 8 that adopted it in 2002, 10 in 2003, so on and so forth. So the key to how I'm going to try and figure out what the causal effect of this program is from other possibly confounding factors is I'm going to say, okay, fine. So if these 10 schools adopted the program in 1996, then I should expect to see that among students at these schools, I should see improvements relative to the 1995 cohort. And I should also see that the improvement for this 1996 cohort relative to the 1995 cohort should be bigger in this school or in these 10 schools than in these schools that adopt the program in 2003. Conversely, in these schools that adopt the program in 2003, I should see larger relative improvements for the 2003 cohort than the 2002 cohort, than the differences across the same cohorts in the schools that adopted the program in 1996. So really what I'm going to do is to say, well, because different schools adopted the program at different times, I should see relatively larger improvements that coincide with the adoption years. And that's how I'm going to be able to identify the program. That's sort of where identification is coming from. So the program itself is privately funded by donors for the most part. Donors pay between 60 and 70% of the cost of the program. And the program is implemented by and large at the district level. It's not always the case, but it's primarily the case. The estimated cost is about $100,000 and $200,000 annually. And adoption works as follows.
So is that cost just for the payment, or is that also for training APT teachers, paying APT teachers?
So yeah, this cost figure is, I'm not 100% sure exactly what goes into this. This is a number that was given to me by the then director. You want to answer that question?
It's about $100,000 to $150,000 per school at the initial adoption fees. That includes all the training, that includes equipment money, that includes the student incentives, there's exam fee reductions, there's a whole element of the components that encompasses. Probably the majority of it is spent in teacher training.
Thank you. So the program adoption works as follows, by and large. So I'm going to give you kind of a caricature of the way the program is adopted, because because each case is going to be somewhat different. But essentially what happens is interested schools would approach AP Strategies and they're put on a list. AP Strategies then goes out and tries to find donors for the schools that are interested, and then the donors would essentially choose a school from this list of schools that are interested in the program. How does who choose? So again, this is where I don't want to go too far, but my understanding is donors kind of choose the schools at which they think they're going to have the highest impact. That doesn't mean they necessarily are choosing the schools where they do have the highest impact, but they're choosing the schools where they expect to have the highest impact. So I know, for example, I think it was when Michael Dell came in. He sort of came in and said that he basically wanted to have, well, one, he chose schools that were in the same area as him, the same geographic location as him, and he wanted to choose sort of the schools that were not doing so well. So that's one thing, that's one component to it. So oftentimes, when you look at a list, you're going to look at the schools that look like they're the sort of the least well off. Yeah.
There's an effort also made to choose schools that do not have any other interventions that could impact similar outcomes?
I don't know if that was something that was chosen, if that was a reason for choosing schools, but I do know the schools that have other things going on.
They do have other things.
So I know the ones that have other things going on. So one of the things that I do is I've rerun all the analyses with schools that I know other things are happening. And in fact, there's one donor in particular that had 5 schools. I won't mention the name. Chose 5 schools and decided to, in addition to have this program, they decided to fund, to basically pay for scholarships for any student who was involved in the program. Now that's going to be a confounder in this analysis to some extent, but I know exactly what those schools are and I could take them out of the analysis and everything goes through.
But prior programs wouldn't matter because that's where your intertemporal variation sort of takes care of that, right?
That's right. So anything that's at the state level, that's certainly going to take care of that. But one might worry that there might be some other programs that are adopted in the same schools around the same point in time. And again, I know what those schools are. And I'll just say, since you guys are all familiar with the context, most of the schools that have other things going on are going to serve as my comparison schools. So basically, Houston is a big one where there's a whole bunch of stuff. I think the Gear Up program is big there, or maybe Upward Bound. I think Upward Bound is also there. So there are all these programs going on in Houston. Houston is a late adopter. In my identification strategy, like I said, I'm relying on variation in the timing, but because I'm looking at college outcomes, the late adopters aren't really going to be represented in the data. So, if Houston adopts a program in 2006 or 2007, these kids just graduated in 2008. They're not really going to be in the graduation data. So these schools primarily serve as comparison schools. So that means that whatever I'm going to show you is probably going to be an underestimate of the effect of the program rather than an overestimate. Yeah. So to quote the then Vice President of AP Strategies, no longer at the moment, he said, many districts are interested in the program, but there are no donors. So there's always a shortage of donors. So this is also going to be sort of key for my identification strategy. So I'm going to argue that basically what's happening is we have a whole bunch of schools that want to have this program put in their schools. And what's happening is a donor is going to come in and kind of throw darts at a dartboard in a somewhat arbitrary way. And if that's true, then it's not necessarily random, but it's kind of like an experiment in the sense that some schools are going to get it and some schools aren't. And the reason one school is getting it and one school is not has nothing to do necessarily with anything that's necessarily important. It just has to do with something that's kind of observable about the school that we can observe here in the data ourselves. Under that characterization, we can analyze these data almost as if it was sort of like an experiment. And that's sort of the way I'm going to be analyzing it. Yeah.
So, do you actually know who the donors are then for each school?
Yes.
And have you tried to include information about the donors or their companies as part of the analyses? Because I wonder about that. I mean, if I'm a donor, I want to help those schools which are closest to me.
Right.
And then, so have you used any donor characteristics?
So I have not used any donor characteristics, no. But I do know I think I know who they are for all of them. Or at least all the 51 that are in my data. But I haven't used those characteristics, no. I mean, essentially, it may just be a sample size issue. When you have 50 observations, you don't want to be breaking the data up too much. Yeah.
Isn't it possible that there could be something important in the selection? Because you mentioned that the donors are interested in schools where they're more likely to succeed.
Yes.
Now that could be potentially because the principal there is highly motivated, is proactive,
right.
is reaching out,
That's right.
which could impact outcomes as well.
That's absolutely right. So the key identifying assumption in this paper is going to be that I'm relying on changes over time. So remember I said before, the way I'm going to identify the program is to see whether there are larger relative improvements, i.e. changes over time in these schools at the timing of adoption versus other times. So if the story is that these 10 schools had very highly motivated principals and these schools had like laggard principals, I'm not saying that's the case, but if that's the story, then it may be true that these schools might have good outcomes relative to these schools, but there's no reason why these schools would have a larger change in 1996 relative to these schools in 1996, and that these schools would have a larger change in 2007 relative to those highly motivated schools in 1996. In other words, what I'm saying is I'm relying on changes that occur at the time of adoption of the program. And insofar as adoption of the program occurs, well, first of all, it occurs typically about a year or two after the ball sort of gets rolling. So if there was really an effect of like principal motivation that led to being selected, we should see effects the year before or 2 years before the program's adopted. And I find no evidence of that. That's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is for this to really cause a serious problem for my analysis, using this sort of method, you need motivation to change within the schools over time. And you need the change in that motivation to exactly coincide with the timing of adoption, not the timing of actually being selected.
And I'm assuming you can control for change in principals. If there was a change in who was the principal of the school, you can control for that.
Yeah, so I don't control for it, but I show that they're uncorrelated. I show that changes in principles is uncorrelated, or the timing of changes in principles is uncorrelated with timing of adoption. So I do have that, and I do show that. Yeah.
I'm from the Richardson School District, and I mean that's an ever-changing situation. Ever-changing. Between the AP teachers, the students, some year you have good students, some year you don't. And the principals, it's just...
So over time, it
I
kind
don't
of
know how
all...
you would ever get a snapshot where something's not changing. It's just constant.
Yeah. Following on that comment, if the donors are conditioning on completely random shocks that have nothing to do with performance metrics that have nothing to do with attitudes or teacher quality or school quality.
I'm not saying that.
No, I'm saying mini thought experiment here. But then would reversion to the mean? I mean, if they're just conditioning on schools that are low performers in a particular year but will revert to the mean, wouldn't you find improvements that may have nothing to do with
Yes. Yes. So again, this is where the timing comes in. So if that's the case, if the selection has to do with having a bad outcome 2 years before, then we should see improvements before the program is even put in place. Oh, we can see that. So this is where timing comes in. And in fact, what you're going to see in the data is that the improvements occur not in year 1, but it really happened in year 2. And the reason it happens in year 2, which I haven't gotten to yet, is that in year 1, if you think about it, the 11th graders have 1 year of exposure to the program. In year 2, the 11th graders and 12th graders get it. So the first cohort to be sort of fully treated, as I describe it, is the second cohort, not the first cohort. And you see small improvements for the first cohort, but you see the biggest effect for the second cohort. And for many outcomes, it's for the second cohort beyond is where you see the biggest impact. So this sort of mean reversion stuff, you're describing something that's like an Ashenfelter's dip type story, to some extent. We can look at how outcomes evolve over time, and you'll see that that's not the case. Like when I show you the figure, you're going to raise another concern, which is that when maybe what's happening is these schools were already improving, so maybe there's some pre-existing trends in the data that you're picking up, and there's some evidence of that. But there's no evidence of this mean reversion story that you're coming up. When you see the figure, you'll see it.
But you couldn't, this won't identify versus, say, a serially correlated random shock. If there was, say, an AR1 process that had nothing to do with the school characteristics we care about, then you could conceivably see this 1 year delay.
That's right. That's right.
I'm very much interested in the evidence.
No, you're
just
right.
wondering,
So, yes,
not
you're
quite
right.
understanding the identification.
You're right. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I haven't actually shown you that. I haven't even gone to that slide yet, but you're absolutely right. If that were the case, it could generate bias, and it could generate spurious positive effects, even if there were none. However, when I show you the pattern of results, all those concerns are going to be assuaged. I'm 99% sure that's the case. Okay, so if you look at this is just showing you a map of Texas, obviously, and in the red areas are the districts that adopt the program at some point in time, and I've also shown you the income levels of the areas. So what you're basically seeing here is that the districts that adopt the program tend to be located in inner city areas that are relatively low income. Higher income is denoted with darker areas that are surrounded by darker areas. So these are inner city areas that are relatively poor, surrounded by more affluent suburbs, and basically that's what we're seeing for most of the stuff. The one exception is Yoseta, which is a sort of a more of a rural district, but for the most part, that's what we see. So now if you just break down school demographics, I'll go over these slides really quickly. What you find is that I've shown you 3 characteristics: the percentage of white students, the percentage of economically disadvantaged students, and whether the school is located in what we call a city. So essentially, about 30% of the schools selected for the program, or I should say, about 30% of students at schools that were selected for the program were white, compared to about 61% for other schools in the state. So these schools are very different in terms of the student demographics. They're large African American and largest would be Hispanic populations. The percentage of economically disadvantaged, however, is actually not that different between these schools and the rest of the schools in the state. I think this is primarily due to the fact that we also have low-income rural areas and a subsample of schools that is often ignored in much research, but this certainly exists, and you can see it here in this comparison. And finally, the big difference here is the urbanicity. About 90% of the schools that were selected for the program are in a city, compared to about 20% for the rest of the state. I show you this slide for 2 reasons. One is to characterize the schools, but the second reason is to basically convince you that comparing schools that were selected for the program to other schools in the state is probably misguided, because they're just very different fundamentally. So really what you want to be doing is looking at schools that are very, very, very similar and share very, very similar characteristics. So what I'm going to do in this paper is I'm not going to look at these schools at all. I'm only going to focus on these schools that were selected for the program, and I'm going to look within the subsample of schools that were selected for the program. I'm going to identify the effects of differences in when the adoption took place. So I'm going to compare the early adopters to the late adopters, and that's really where I'm going to get the variation. Do the early adopters see improvements earlier? Do the late adopters see improvements later? And that's really where the variation is coming from. and I'm going to throw these schools out entirely. Because I don't want to be comparing a school that was motivated enough to adopt the program to a school that was not motivated enough to adopt the program. Because then I'm really comparing apples to oranges, and I want to make sure I'm comparing apples to apples. All schools in my data set were interested to have the program at some point in time. So they're more similar along this sort of dimension that might be really, really important. So the teachers themselves got monetary,
Sorry, you said there was I don't know, real quick. You said there was a queue for schools that wanted to be in to have donors. Did you use those in any way? So those are motivated but just didn't?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have that information. Maybe I could get that information. I don't know. I don't have that. I certainly did not have the information. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that would be ideal because that would actually more closely mimic the thought experiment that I had described in the beginning. What I'm showing you is kind of a deviation from that. And ideally, if I had all the schools that wanted the program at any point in time, that would actually be arguably a better comparison group. But I don't have that information. If they're available, I'd be happy to have it. Okay. So the teacher incentives are structured as follows. So AP teachers receive between $100 and $500 for each advanced placement score of 3 or higher earned by an 11th or 12th grade student in their AP class. The key thing is here, the student actually has to take the AP class with that teacher for the teacher to get the reward. So the student has to take the class and do well on the exam. Teachers also have bonus opportunities. I won't go into too much detail. The reason that there's a range between $100 and $500 is not because it's random, but it's because some schools pay $100 per exam and some schools pay $500 per exam. So there are differences in a level of the incentives paid in each school or across schools. Teachers also receive additional salary for the extra time they spend with training and preparation, and they also have other bonus opportunities based on how their students perform. So there's one example here of a lead AP teacher who was written up in, I forget exactly what newspaper wrote up the story, but one of these lead AP teachers received a bonus of $11,550 in 1 year from her involvement in the program. So these incentives are non-trivial when you think that the median starting salary for a teacher in Texas is about $40,000. This is about 25% of that. So this is a non-trivial improvement on her salary. So you might think this might lead to some behavioral change. And that's sort of the idea. So the student incentives are actually very similar. So students in 11th and 12th grade, the first thing is they have half of their examination fees paid, which is important. If you think that one of the reasons why we see differences in advanced placement exam participation has to do with the fact that some students just can't pony up $82 for every single exam, this might be one component that might lead to large increases in participation in the AP program. The second thing is students in 11th and 12th grade receive between $100 and $500 for each passing score earned on an AP exam. Again, this is contingent on having taken the AP course, so it's not like some smart kid can just say, oh, well, I'm just going to go take the exam and not take the course because I'm going to get $100 or $500. That's not going to happen. You have to sit down in the classroom for a year and endure this like AP calculus class for a year before you're going to get it, and that may not be worth a student's while. But just to put these numbers into context, the program was implemented in 1995. So if you think a student at that point in time, if they were working like a part-time job and earning minimum wage at the time, $5.15 an hour, if they work for 10 hours a week, which is relatively a lot of work for a student still in high school, they're going to earn about $1,900 over a 9-month period during the school year. At certain schools, students could earn more than that just by passing 4 AP exams. So this is, in terms of how much money this is for a student, this is going to be an important amount of money. And also you might think, given that these are student populations that are relatively low income, you might actually see that many of the students are going to be substituting their time away from, say, outside work towards schoolwork as a result of this intervention. And this might be a margin through which this program might be effective for these kinds of students where we may not necessarily see the same thing for other student populations. I'm not sure, but I'm saying that's one reason why we might see larger relative effects for these kind of student populations versus others. Yeah.
Curious question, in terms of the low SES students, they can get a test fee down to almost to $9, whereas the current price for AP exams is $87 for the retail price. So I'm just wondering how that could play into students' motivation, et cetera.
Right. So my understanding is that if you are low SES, if you're eligible for free or reduced price lunch, you get a test fee reduction of, I believe, $30. There's a federal one, I believe, and then there's a state. Right. Right. And then college board kicks in another $22. Right. So there are various levels of reduction that goes on. So my understanding of the program, at least at the time, was that the typical low-income student would probably end up paying out of pocket around between $10 and $30 per exam. That's my understanding. And if you're high income, you're talking more like $40, $50. That was my understanding back then. And then this would sort of chop that in half. And I guess, and again, it depends on the time because this spans 10 years of data, so it's going to vary across time. It might vary across districts as well, but yeah, that's sort of what it is. But whatever the fee was, this is cutting it in half.
So, it's an obvious question. Do you see differences in performance based on differences in compensation per successful AP course?
Well, yes, I do. Yes. Yeah. So that's like the last slide, but I'll tell you now. Yes, I do. So I did a previous analysis looking at the high school outcomes of these students, and when I did that analysis, I actually found no difference depending on whether you paid 100 or 500 or whatever. But when I looked at the college outcomes, it turns out the gains are much larger in the schools that paid 500 per exam than those that paid 100 per exam. So it does seem like the intensity of the incentives does affect the marginal efficacy of the program. Yeah. Another thing that affects it a lot, I'll just preview the results already, is that you find larger effects in schools that already had well-established advanced placement programs to begin with. So schools that have to grow the program were relatively less effective, but schools that already had a big, well-established program in place were actually very, very, very effective. That's another big difference that I saw across schools. But those are two main observable characteristics I could identify that really determine whether the program was going to be highly successful versus yeah. So who are these new AP takers? I'll just go over this very quickly. So the Texas graduation requirements require 3 years of science, 3 years of math, and English in all 4 years. So what this means is that for students who are taking AP math and science exams, they're basically students who would have either completed the requirements for graduation, taking some elective that is less rigorous, such as anatomy, geology, physiology, or they might be doing nothing at all. They might have like a study hall or something like that. Because if you finish your graduation requirements before junior or senior year, you don't necessarily have to be in the classroom. For English, however, some students who take AP English would have been taking the regular English class typically. That's what's going on here. I would mention that one thing that happens a lot here, given the very, very well-established community college system, is that students could have been taking dual enrollment courses at college. One of the outcomes I looked at in the previous study was to see whether students were less likely to take dual enrollment courses in order to take the advanced placement courses, and I found no evidence of that. So when we see increases in AP participation, it really reflects real increases in the number of students who are exposed to more rigorous material, and the question is, if that's happening, as you can see in this figure, does that really mean these students are going to be better off? And that's really the main question. So this is a slide taken from AP Strategy's website a few years ago. And as you can see here, these are the first 10 schools to adopt the program in Dallas. They're getting incentives for math, science, and English AP exams. And as you can see, for the years prior to the intervention, there's not really much going on here at all. This line here, in terms of the number of AP exams passed, is relatively flat. However, in the first year of the program, it basically doubles, and it keeps on increasing over time. So basically, if you look at this, you say, well, clearly, a larger fraction of students of these high schools are taking AP exams or passing AP exams, so something good is happening here. The question is, how does this extend to other outcomes? How does this extend to longer run outcomes? Are they more likely to go to college? Are they more likely to persist? Are they more likely to graduate? Is this having a real lasting effect on their well-being in the long run? Or is this just some transitory improvement because they're just putting in effort to get paid? That's really the question I want to answer. So I don't have much time, so I'll go very quickly over the theoretical framework. So the basic idea is that standard economic theory will tell you that you're going to get more effort put out by both students and teachers towards advanced placement program when this program exists. So all we're doing here is we're increasing the benefit associated with taking an AP class or studying in the AP class. So we should expect more students to take AP classes, more students to take AP exams, and more students to work hard on these exams. We also expect more teachers to put in more effort, and we also expect teachers to perhaps encourage students to take AP exams and AP courses. So it's actually entirely unsurprising that we see large improvements in advanced placement outcomes as a result of the program from the context of economic theory. However, if you think about the program from the context of standard economic theory, from the student's perspective, this large increase in AP participation is actually kind of surprising. And the reason is, within a standard framework, if you think that students are perfectly rational and perfectly sort of forward-looking into the future, this might be a big assumption, but if that's the way we think people are making decisions, then from some perspective, you might think, okay, well, what are the benefits of taking the advanced placement course? Well, like if I take the advanced placement course, I am going to have an increased likelihood of getting into a college. I might get into a better college, and that's going to bump up my wages. And I might think that in terms of the increase in my wages over time, maybe increases my wages by like 1% a year, which is not a big amount, but it's non-trivial. If I get 1% more per year over my life, this is going to be equal to, actually greater than that, but maybe $30,000 over the lifetime of the student. Now, we're basically saying, before the program, you didn't take the exam. You chose not to take the exam. Now, I've dangled like a few $100s in front of you, and now you've decided to take the exam or put in the effort. This basically is sort of a strange behavior. Now, you might think on the margin, a few students might be affected by this, but you wouldn't expect to see a quadrupling, where's that slide? A quadrupling in the number of students who are taking advanced placement exams in the face of, a few $100s you can earn on this exam, unless something else is going on. In other words, the fact that we see this kind of behavior, suggests that students are not behaving in this perfectly forward-looking, rational way. So they're probably behaving in a way such that they're either before they were behaving myopically, so we're only thinking about things today and not thinking about the long term, or perhaps students were being discouraged by teachers beforehand, or they're being discouraged by their peers. The peer culture may have been different. And also they may have been credit constrained in the sense that maybe students wanted to take these exams, but they couldn't afford to take all these exams because of the test fees were too high, or they might have just been poorly informed. One of the key components of the program is students get a lot of information about the AP program and about the benefits of the AP program. So you might think, well, part of the reasons why we're seeing this big increase in participation has to do with the fact that now they know about the program, they know the benefits of the program, and now they're taking it. So in light of sort of standard economic theory, it's much more likely that one of these more sort of behavioral explanations is explaining this large increase in student participation as opposed to students responding to $200 per se. Another thing is, so we see increases in college going. We might expect to see increases in college going as a result of this thing. So the first is, when students have more AP passes, they're more likely to get admitted to a college conditioned on applying because they're more attractive applicants. So you might think this is going to increase college going, but however, it's not clear this is going to be the case. Because one thing that the AP program does do is it exposes students to college material. So if we think that some students are very optimistic about how well they're going to do in college, and there's a lot of evidence suggesting that they are, if students are really optimistic about going to college, and they take the AP exams or they take the AP courses, they may actually realize, whoa, this is really hard. College isn't for me. Maybe I should think twice about going to college and forget about this thing and go do something else. So it's not obvious that we're going to see an increase in college going just because students are more likely to be exposed to the AP program. It's entirely possible that things go in the opposite direction and that it might be demotivating because students now see that college is hard or harder than they expected, and they now change their decisions. So the overall effect on college going is going to be sort of ambiguous. The other outcome is what happens when they actually get to college. So we think, so if you're taking the AP exams, and if the AP exams really do expose you to more rigorous material, you should know more stuff. And if students know more stuff, we expect them to do better when they get to college. But again, it's not entirely clear this is going to be the case. One is due to the fact that there's some evidence now that when you provide these external motivators for students, or for anyone, what happens is you take effort from one task and you divert it to something else. So it's entirely possible that when we see these large increases in advanced placement participation in terms of students taking the courses, taking the exams, and studying for them and doing well, this may be coming at the expense of something else. So maybe I work hard for my math AP exam, but I stopped spending time reading. So when I get to college, I can't read, but I can add. So overall, I actually end up being worse off than otherwise. This is a scenario that may sound somewhat contrived, but certainly it's a possibility. So there's another reason why you shouldn't just look at the improvements in AP outcomes and say this necessarily is going to translate into better outcomes later on. Another reason why we might be worried about this is that there's some evidence out there that test scores can be boosted artificially. And in fact, there's some experimental work basically showing that if you give someone a monetary incentive on the day of the exam, you can improve their test scores by about say about 20% of a year's worth of learning. Clearly that student didn't learn 20% more on the day of the exam. It's just that there's a large effort margin, meaning that if a student's lazy, they're going to score one way, and if they actually put in the time, they're going to score a different way. So just by basically boosting effort, you can see large increases in test scores, and these improved outcomes could be due to increased effort. Another thing is there's some evidence now that if you carbo load the day of an exam, you can do better. And in fact, I think they're doing this in Chicago right now, where they're saying, oh, right on testing day, they're like, hey, what's that? Yeah, exactly. Have spaghetti, carbo load, make sure your kids are well fed on the day of the exam so they can do better. So there are a lot of different reasons why we should be somewhat, at least stand back and say, well, let's dig deeper into the data and make sure this thing really is going to have an effect. So there are a lot of reasons why this initial improvement in AP participation and AP outcomes need not necessarily translate into better outcomes in college. So the effect is going to be ambiguous. So to investigate this matter, I'm going to use data. I'm going to go quickly. I basically use data that are housed here in Texas. So I have middle school and high school data from the Texas Education Agency, and it spans the years 1994 through 2007. This has information on student race, gender, free lunch status, LEP status. I have their 8th grade test scores and their 10th grade test scores on the state mandated tests, the TOS or the TOX, depending on the year. I have the AP courses taken. I also have AP data from the College Board for the same years. And I was able to link up these data, or they linked up the data, with data from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, which contains all colleges in Texas from 96 to 2010. For some of the years, I think private schools are not included, but for some of the years they are. I believe 2003 is the year that private schools entered the data. And I also, which I don't have here, was able to link up some of these students in National Student Clearinghouse data, which has information on students if they enter college out of state. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So all my analysis is actually going to be based on a cohort of 10th graders rather than a cohort of 11th graders and 12th graders. And that'll be clear why I do that in a second. So I'll just go straight to that. Okay. So the reason I do that is instead of saying, oh, the 12th graders who are involved in the program score better than the 12th graders who are not involved in the program, the reason I don't do that is because students might change their behavior or change their enrollments as a result of the program. So if there's any worry that students in the district might say, oh, well, or parents in the district say, well, okay, my kid goes to this school, and this school doesn't have the APIP program, and my son's pretty smart. Why don't I enroll my son in this school over here where he might get $2,000 for taking all these exams? And so I'm going to move him from this school to that school. And I know many of these school districts and many school districts in the state actually have open enrollment, or they have basically once you're in the district, it's not that hard to move across schools. So if you compare the outcomes of 12th graders who are exposed to 12th graders who are not, potentially what you're getting is that some motivated kids might be selecting into the treatment schools in 12th grade, and you're going to get bias. So to get around that, I'm not going to look at the outcomes of students in 11th grade and 12th grade. Well, I'm not going to look at the outcomes of students based on their 11th grade or 12th grade schooling enrollment. I'm going to look at the outcomes of students based on their 10th grade enrollment. That is to say, if you attended a school while you were in 10th grade that became a treatment school after or while you were enrolled there, I'm going to code you as treated. So even if you left your school and you weren't actually treated, I'm coding you as treated. And by the same logic, if you decided in your 11th grade year to switch from a school that was not treated to enter a school that was treated in 11th grade, even though you were actually treated, the way that I'm coding the data, you are not treated. Now you might think, well, why would you do something that intentionally gives you the wrong answer? The reason is that this basically leads me to underestimate the effect of the program. Because what's happening is some of my treated people are not treated, and some of my untreated people are treated. So by construction, by the way I've set this up, I'm sort of setting up I'm basically raising the hurdle for myself to make sure that when I show you something that's positive, it really is positive. Because if I do the opposite, the worry is going to be that maybe you just stack the deck towards finding an effect. So I'm trying to stack the deck against finding an effect. So insofar as we see something, it means there's something real happening. So identification here is as follows. So I'm going to focus on those schools that adopt the program before 2008 to control for selection. And I'm basically going to compare the difference in outcomes across intention-to-treat cohorts and non-intention-to-treat cohorts from the same schools to the difference in outcomes across cohorts in the schools that don't adopt the program over the same time period. And by intention-to-treat, I just mean those cohorts that would have been treated if they stayed in their 10th grade school. And that's where intention comes in, because they're not necessarily treated, but they're intended for treatment. So this cohort-based strategy removes the effects of any state policies because I'm looking at schools that didn't adopt the program over the same time period to remove that confounding variation. And also because I'm comparing outcomes for the entire cohort, I'm not going to be biased due to selection within a cohort. So the standard concern is, well, if you see one student take an AP exam and one student who doesn't, the reason is one selected to take AP and this guy didn't. So that's going to be biased.
Point A depends on if the state level policy affects the control schools, affects the treated schools and the control schools in the same manner.
That's exactly right. This is why honing in on this relatively homogeneous population of schools that adopted at any point in time is going to be really helpful. But you're exactly right. Yeah. So by basically comparing across cohorts, we know that the reason that the treated cohort takes more AP exams is because they adopted the program. That's nice. So by comparing across cohorts rather than making comparisons among students within cohorts, I basically remove the effect of this selection bias within a cohort. And then finally, I remove selection across schools because I'm not comparing school A to school B. I'm looking at changes within school A and comparing it to changes within some comparison to school B. So this basically lays down the logic of the intervention, or the logic of the identification. So let's take school 1 and school 2. School 1 adopts the program in 2003. School 2 adopts the program in 2008. So let's look at the 10th grade cohort, which is the cohort which is sort of the unit of analysis. So the 10th graders in 2000, they should be 12th graders in 2002. They may not necessarily be, but they should be. So by the time they graduate from school 1, the 10th graders in 2000, they're exposed to the program for 0 years. They're not exposed to the program at all. In the same school, the 10th graders who attended that school in 2003, they're going to graduate. Their expected graduation year is 2005. So by the time they graduate, the program should have been in place for 3 years. So for this cohort, the intended years of treatment is 0. And for this cohort, the intended years of treatment is 3. By comparison, in a school that adopted the program in 2008, the same cohort in school 2, they're never exposed to the program. And also the 2003 cohort in school 2, because this school adopted it way later, they're also never exposed to the program. So let's say the mean outcomes for these different cohorts in these different schools are A, B, C, and D. Basically, B minus A identifies the effect of the program plus the effect of any changes that occurred across those cohorts. And comparisons between D and C in the comparison schools basically removes the effect of the time stuff across cohorts, but because neither of these cohorts is treated, it doesn't have the treatment effect. So then B minus A minus D minus C basically identifies the effect of being exposed to the program for 3 years. And this is exactly what I'm going to be doing. This is all done within a regression format where we have the outcome as a function of student demographics, 10th grade test scores, I'm going to control for that, high school fixed effects, and cohort fixed effects. But this is exactly the logic of the identification. That's basically what's going on here. I just want to make one thing clear. This intention to treat variable measures how long the program would have been in place when the student was expected to graduate from high school. That's the definition of this variable, just to be very clear about what it is. The other thing I want to make clear is that the first affected cohorts are only exposed to the program for 1 year, and then really the first fully treated cohort is a second cohort. So this is ITT year 2, intention for treatment year 2. So this is what the data look like, and this is how the figures sort of pan out. Now, like I said, when you see this, you're going to say, whoa, it looks like there's some trending going on in some of these outcomes. And you're exactly right. So here, we have the number of AP courses taken. It looks as though there's some upward trajectory even before the program's adopted. I should just point out, year 0 is the first year of adoption, and year 1 is the second cohort. So what this is telling you is that even before the program is adopted, it seemed as though there may have been some upward trend in AP course taking going on here. After adoption, it looks like something's happening, but this is clearly something that might be sort of difficult to detect. For AP exams passed, things look a little cleaner. As you can see here, AP exams passed, it does look like there may be some kind of upward trend before the program's adopted, but it's pretty clear that in year 0, the year that the program first is implemented, we see a much larger jump than we see in previous years, and it continues to go up over time. So relative to trend, there's something going on here. So I'm just drawing some trend lines here based on the pre-data to give you a sense of what's happening relative to trend. Over here, this is whether you're ever a freshman in any school. We see, again, some trending in the data, but we see improvements relative to trend. The variables where the improvements are much more clear and much more obvious are whether you persist. So whether you're ever enrolled in a school as a sophomore, here, there's very minimal evidence of trending, and we see a clear increase relative to trend. And if we ask the question, well, did you stay in school to be a sophomore given that you were a freshman? We see that the trending here is essentially 0, and we see a big pop-up after the program is adopted. So this tells us that maybe there's some increase in AP course taking. There's clearly an increase in AP passes, AP exam passes. College going looks like there's an effect, but we can argue about whether that's a trend or not. But for things like persisting in sophomore year, and the last outcome here I have is GPA, and your GPA, it's clear evidence that there's an improvement relative to trend in these outcomes. So these are just the numbers. I'm basically out of time, so I'm just going to go over them very quickly. So what I find when I look at the data is that so the treated cohorts take about 0.61 more AP courses. This effect is marginally statistically significant. It's not very significant, but it looks like there's an effect there. And what I have here is I've mapped out the effects for the first treated cohort, the second, which is the sort of the first fully treated cohort, cohort 3, and then cohort 4 and above. And you can see the effects sort of increase over time, as you saw in the previous figure. And I'll just go straight to the punchline. We see AP course taking increasing by about 25%. AP exam and AP exam passing goes up by about 80%. If you look at going to college, this goes up by about 4.2 percentage points. Ever being a freshman at a school, relative to base, this is about an 8% increase in college going that we're seeing on average. And most of this is coming from enrolling in 4-year colleges rather than enrollment in 2-year colleges. The last thing I look at over here is I look to see whether these increases are happening because students are enrolling in, or whether these increases are happening because students are no longer going in-state, but they're going out of state, or they're no longer going out of state, but going in-state. So the one worry is, oh, well, now you have this program, and maybe it's causing students who would have gone out of state to go in-state. And in fact, there's no increase in actual educational attainment at all. All that's happening is I'm just picking up those that arrived in Texas, and I'm losing those that went elsewhere. There are a few cohorts where you have data from the National Student Clearinghouse, which covers the entire nation, and basically I find that there's no effect on enrolling out of state, but there's a clear increase for enrolling in state. So basically, these increases in college enrollment are real. Looking to the GPA, I'll go over that very quickly. If you look at the freshman year GPA, I find that it goes up by about 0.68 grade points on average. And then when you look at whether you're a sophomore, I find that the program increases the likelihood that a student is enrolled at a college as a sophomore by about 6 percentage points. That's about a 40-50% increase relative to baseline. Yeah, I'll just go on there. So one question one might have is, well, maybe what's happening here is that you're not getting a real effect. Maybe what's happening here is people are deciding to go to school earlier, and you're just picking that up, right? So what could be happening is, well, I was going to go to college in 2004, but now I got this program and I'm just going to school in 2003. So when I look at whether you go to college, I'm just picking up differences in timing rather than differences in college going per se. The only way to deal with this is to have data that, when you look at individuals when they're 40 years old. But because I'm still in a window where there are going to be differences in college, in the timing of college, which could affect the results, it's important to sort of rule that out. So all I did here was I defined the variables, whether you went to college within 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. And if the results were driven by differences in timing, we should see big effects in going within 1 year that should basically disappear once we go to going to college within 5 years. Because people who would have gone for 2 years now are going after 1 year, then we should see effects there, but we should see no effects for going within 5 years. Doing this analysis basically shows you that the effects actually grow as you increase the time horizon from high school graduation, suggesting that people are actually going to school more, not just doing it sooner. Same thing for being a sophomore. So because I'm short on time, I'm going to really be fast. So the last thing I'll talk about is differences in across different ethnic groups and gender. I broke down some of these outcomes, and basically what I find here is that there are not that many differences in terms of the advanced placement outcomes across ethnicity. But when we look at the performance when they're in college, we see these big differences. We see big GPA effects, particularly for black students, on the order of about 0.138 grade points, which is pretty big. And then when you look at sophomore year persistence, whether you actually enrolled in a school as a second year, we see big differences there as well. We see that the likelihood of ever being a sophomore, for whites, it's a big effect there too. It increases it by about 12%. but the increase for blacks and Hispanics are more in the order of like 60 or 70%. So the big increases there as well, relative increases. Looking across gender, there really wasn't much that differed. The big difference was it looked as though there may have been a larger college-going effect for females than for males. So last thing I'll do is talk about the graduation outcome. So again, this has the same problem of sort of not having data when they're sort of completed with all their schooling. So differences in timing could affect it, but I'll analyze it anyway. So what I'm going to do here is really focus on the first few cohorts to adopt the program and get rid of all the really late ones to get some idea. And you can't really see much there, so I'll just zoom in. So basically, if you look across all students, I don't see any effect on graduation. So on average, there's very little effect on graduation. However, when you break up the sample based on ethnic background, you start to see big differences emerge. Specifically, you see increases in the likelihood of graduating with a bachelor's degree for black students on the order of about 1.8 percentage points. This is almost a doubling of the rate because not very many blacks in 10th grade actually obtain a bachelor's degree. And for Hispanics, we see a much larger increase, about 2.5 percentage points. And again, this is more than the difference. It's like increasing it by about 250%. It's a very big increase in the number of Hispanic students who are graduating with a bachelor's degree. So these are just showing you the relative improvements over here. So there are a few other threats to validity, which I will not spend too much time on. But one is, timing is endogenous. I ran all these results. I've included placebo treatments. So I show that basically the improvements in outcomes occur after a program is adopted, not before. The other thing is you might think that pre-existing trends confound the analysis. So most of the results are robust to including linear time trends for every single school. Not everything necessarily is robust because standard errors blow up a lot, but by and large the results are consistent across that specification check. And finally you might think, well maybe, so you have this 10th grade thing, or maybe students are selecting the 10th grade. To deal with that issue, I can basically look at the feeder middle schools for all the high schools, and I can identify all the feeder schools, and I can toss out any student who didn't attend the natural feeder middle school for these high schools, and that actually increases the point estimate. That makes the effect stronger, so that's not driving the effect either. Finally, I'll talk about mechanisms, which I mentioned earlier. So another thing you might think is, well, maybe there's something else going on at the school that's driving these effects, right? And if that's so, then we might see improvements for all kids at the school, and not just those who take APs. If this has something to do with the AP program, we should see improvements for students who take AP courses and exams and not see improvements for those who don't. And that's exactly what I see. So if you break up the sample into students who are likely to take AP exams and those who are not, the way I figure that out is I take a regression, I look at all the students' observed characteristics in 10th grade, and I run a regression for whether you would likely take APs in the control sample, and I basically use that model to predict who's likely to take APs in the treatment group. And here, this is if you have a propensity to take it above 66%, you have these big effects. And if your propensity to take AP courses is below 33%, then you basically see nothing. Break up the sample again. Like I said, those schools that had to grow a lot due to the AP program versus those that were already well established. We see large increases in the outcomes here are AP courses taken, AP exams passed, ever being a freshman and never being a sophomore. We see big effects for those schools that had relatively little growth. And these were schools that had very big, well-established AP programs to begin with. The schools that were kind of small and had to grow saw very small effects in terms of these longer run outcomes. And then when you look versus the schools that paid 100 per exam versus those that paid more than 100, we see clear evidence of strong positive effects for those that paid more money. We see smaller effects for those schools that paid less money. Finally, in terms of what may be going on, I know I'm over time and I apologize. I spoke to guidance counselors about what may be going on, and all of them emphasized these four things. They emphasized information. They said students are much better informed about the program now than they were in the past. They said that teachers, there was just a different culture in the schools in general, where teachers are much more encouraging to students about doing things, and there was a greater sort of culture of inclusion. The fourth thing they said was peer attitudes changed a lot. So the story was that, a kid can always go to their friends and say, well, I don't really want to take this math class. I'm just doing it because I want to save it for an iPad or something. And somehow that sort of gave them some cover, some plausible deniability to allow them to act like a nerd, and that was okay. And that once you had a critical mass of students doing this, somehow the stigma associated with taking AP courses was no longer there, and the peer attitudes changed. These are the kinds of stories that economists don't typically get involved in, but this is something that I heard, so I just wanted to sort of relay that to you. So to conclude, the incentives associated with the APIP does increase student exposure to AP courses. So students are exposed to courses that are more rigorous. It increased college going among students and is associated with sophomore year persistence for all groups of students. The improvements were relatively larger for Hispanic and Black students, and these are students who are sort of less likely to persist in college to begin with. They're sort of the students where there's more room for improvement. And the fact that these students are improving, despite the fact that they're seniors and juniors in high school, suggests that it's not too late to have an effect on student outcomes. You can actually do something when they're in high school to improve their outcomes. And lastly, I think the fact that we see these large increases in AP participation suggests that the levels that we typically see in terms of AP taking and AP participation, or just rigorous courses in general, might not have been optimal. Maybe we need to actually increase the amount of exposure students have to high quality, rigorous courses. And lastly, these interventions can be effective and they can reduce gaps across schools and across students within schools, and it's not very costly. So I did a cost-benefit analysis, and basically I found that in order for this program not to be cost-effective, based on a whole bunch of assumptions, would require that the benefit of going to college for 1 year would be less than half of 1% in terms of wages. We know that going to college increases, 1 year of college increases your earnings by about 7%. So the break-even point is half of 1% for this program. So this program is very, very cost-effective.